Good afternoon. Welcome to my talk on multilingual learners in the Polish school, a challenge or an opportunity. My name is Joanna Rokita-Jaśkow and I represent Pedagogical University of Krakow. I'm very happy to share with you the subject of our research, because at our university is famous not only for educating teachers, future teachers, including language teachers, but also for research on educational issues. So this talk is directed both at current teachers, practicing teachers, but also future teachers, those who would like to study English and become teachers of English as well. So maybe, this talk will also make you aware of a few issues that practicing teachers need to face. In this talk, I would like to focus on the issue of multilingualism because it's a relatively new issue, right? Also appearing in Polish schools. As an introduction, of course, let me mention that both multilingualism and bilingualism, which I will be using interchangeably, not in the sense that they are synonymous, but because different constellations of languages appear in our learners. Some learners will know just 2 languages, while others may know more. So for this reason, these 2 terms may appear in my talk. So multilingualism is usually, not only, but very often an outcome of migration. And the sources of multilingualism are connected with mixed families, so people marrying a partner from a different speech community, or typically a translocation of the family. A family emigrates in search of better life prospects, or just sometimes these are also refugees, right, who might escape a difficult situation in their home country. People are also bilingual or multilingual just because they live in an international community. It's very typical nowadays that there are outsourcing companies opening in various cities and attracting workers from different countries. This is partly taking place also in Poland, in such cities as Warsaw and Krakow. But of course, such international communities are typically London, Hong Kong, or Paris. And of course, people are multilingual if they belong to an ethnic or national minority group. That is, then they usually learn or acquire a language of their parents or grandparents, if they care for that, right? So their heritage language. Why I'm mentioning this issue is the fact that Poland, for a very long time, especially after the Second World War, was generally a very homogeneous country, linguistically homogeneous. So even in teaching at school, generally, all learners were just Polish and speaking Polish. This situation, is changing, has been changing, particularly for the last decade. As you can see, the major directions of migration, these are the directions, of course, from the east, particularly from the Ukraine, but also from Belarus, Russia. Also, there might be learners from further east, from Asian countries like Vietnam. And the second route of migration are also return migrants. A lot of Poles emigrated when Poland joined European Union particularly to English-speaking countries like Great Britain, Ireland, but also to Norway, Germany, Holland. And a lot of these families now come back with their children, and these children go back to school. And it's very important to realize that these children, either being born abroad or if they spent the first few years abroad, they are practically bilingual. And this may also cause bilingual and bicultural, because they grew up in a different culture than Polish, even though they may have Polish citizenship. This might be also a new challenge for the teacher. And just to make you aware of how the situation changed, let me show you the graph from the NIC report, right, which shows how the numbers are changing. In 2009, over 9,600 students were noted in the Polish school, and these were generally migrant learners. No data is actually taken for returned migrant children, just because they have Polish citizenship. And this is this was in 2009. And over a decade, in 2019, we may see systematic growth, particularly from 2014. You can see in 2019, there were over 40,000 of migrant learners in the Polish school. Plus, there are returned migrants who are not counted. So we can see that the phenomenon is growing, and practically in every school we may find a student with migration background who as a result becomes bi or even multilingual. A similar outcome we also noted in our research project, to which I'm going to refer. We identified in the interviews we took, generally that the migrants which we noticed were either immigrant learners, about 22 cases. Just a fewer were mixed. There were those children who came from mixed families living in Poland, or those who were non-native bilinguals, but also another important proportion of migrant learners or multilingual learners were returned migrant children, particularly from Polish families emigrating to UK, USA, Ireland, that is English-speaking countries, and they were either born abroad or born in Poland. Some of them were even coming from mixed families, that is Polish-English or Polish-Irish or Polish-German, and also maybe born abroad. In that case, there could be even 3 languages coming into question. So I'm illustrating this just to show you that there's a linguistic scene in Poland is changing, right? And Poland, we may say, is a country in transition from mono to multilingual country. And this is something that, well, teachers and future teachers should be also prepared to face. Richard Ruiz, an American social linguist, when the linguistic scene in America changed, or in American schools, identified that there can be 3 approaches to language policy planning. We may look at multilingualism as a problem, right? That is, or even as a threat, maybe, to linguistic homogeneity, as a right for the children to speak their languages when they can, and as a resource. This last trend is particularly favored, especially in Western European countries nowadays, because where the phenomenon is much stronger, and translanguaging, that is allowing for code mixing even in classrooms, is a pedagogy that is being favored. Now, I will refer to these issues later in my talk. Now, before I go further to show you, I just want you to mention that even though bilingualism is a new phenomenon in Poland, numerous research on bilingualism and multilingualism has been conducted in those countries where it is a much more frequent phenomenon, mainly due to more considerable numbers of migrants, like in Canada or America, but also Great Britain or France. Just to mention a few names, well, of course, these were studies in Canada back from 1970s, 1980s by Jim Cummings, Alan Bialystok, and more recently, beginning of the 21st century by Sparks and Genshaw or the Angelis. Just to summarize the research, I just want to highlight that they that having conducted a number of studies on bilinguals, they generally have found bilingualism as a beneficial feature for the bilinguals themselves, right? That it brings many cognitive benefits, and it's perhaps good to remember this because bilinguals should not be seen as deficient by any means. In general, bilinguals, they are much better than monolinguals in the following areas, like better field independence. This is ability to notice details in some larger wholes of distracting elements. This is what is usually tested in tests of intelligence. So much better analytical abilities. Greater attentional control. They can quickly switch attention from one item to another, right, from one activity to another as well. They are much better in creative thinking, like, for example, producing neologisms, just because they function within two linguistic codes. Enhanced metalinguistic awareness, especially phonological awareness, right? Acuity to sounds, right? They are very sensitive to differing sounds. Also, in more recent studies, it was found that even in their first language, or the more dominant language, they learn to recognize words faster and learn to read in this dominant language faster. They might also have communicative abilities in their first language, much better in the dominant, and the same skills are transferred between the first and the second language. So there is a kind of mutual interdependence between the two languages. And finally, because of these analytical abilities, bilinguals very often show better mathematical abilities. They are much better at maths. So this is what is already well known, right? What has been found through research. Therefore, bilingualism per se is a gift, right? Is a gift which gives a bilingual learner a lot of benefits. I'm mentioning this because, of course, it's a new phenomenon which may be unknown to many teachers. Of course, there are certain problems in early bilingualism, like the impact of affectivity. This is connected with the fact that sometimes bilinguals might have slightly lower self-esteem in case of using a minority language, right? If the children speak a language which has a lower status, and simply also if it's not present in education. Sometimes, if they also multilinguals, if they are changing the place of living quite frequently with their families, they also, well, may be characterized by lack of emotional stability, as it was found in some studies. when it comes to language development, sometimes, as I said, sometimes if it's a minority language that is dominant in a bilingual, which is absent in education, there might be difficulties in mastering literacy, so learning to read and write. Bilingualism also sometimes makes it difficult to recognize specific learning difficulties, like dyslexia, because very often a bilingual learner who has problems in learning to read, it's not because of bilingualism, but because of dyslexia, but sometimes it's mistakenly understood. Now, so I mentioned these just to make you perhaps understand who bilinguals are and what kind of benefits and problems they may have. Now, is there any language policy in Poland? Just because it's a period of transition, generally there is no real policy concerning migration, as we can learn from the document by Sobczak Schultz and others. And as regards educational issues, there are just two excerpts which devote space to the rights of bilinguals or multilinguals in the Polish school. This is a bill called Prawo Oświatowe, and in part 7 it mentions how educating persons coming from abroad should be conducted. And there is one regulation of the Ministry of Education, and they mention that generally a learner coming from abroad has the right to additional Polish language classes in the first year of coming home, coming to Poland, and generally that there might be in the following years some additional help in a subject. But this is very little. So it seems the problem is still being unnoticed. Yeah, it is being unnoticed, and not enough provision is given to these learners. So as a result, teachers have to be agents of change, right? Teachers have to face the problem, the challenge themselves. So our question is, how are the teachers prepared? Are they prepared? With this view in mind, we have undertook a project in our university, in the Institute of English Studies and in the chair of English language teaching, with myself as a group leader and 3 other colleagues, right? Dr. Werona Król-Gierat, Katarzyna Nosilak, and Agata Wolanin. And our key hypothesis was that, well, let's focus on EFL teachers, right? Because EFL teachers, are bilinguals themselves. So perhaps having the experience of learning 2 languages, of knowing 2 languages, maybe they are more open-minded, perhaps, because language learning changes the mind. Also, they may perhaps will be most equipped to understand the difficulties that bilingual learners face in the classroom, and therefore they are most likely to mediate, right, in successful socialization of multilingual learners at school, but also in English class, because we believe that English class itself is can be a kind of like a platform for mutual understanding, for for communication in English. English can be a tool of communication with those multilingual learners as well, because this is what we learn foreign languages for, to communicate with other people, right, coming from abroad, perhaps. Right. So we decided to interview different teachers from different backgrounds, from the city, but also from smaller countries, smaller villages. All of the teachers taught in the primary school, and we conducted some semi-guided interviews with them each lasting about 60 minutes. We transcribed them and then analyzed the content. And this study took in the pandemic year, so we conducted it via Zoom platform. Well, our very first question was about how EFL teachers see a bilingual learner. We wanted, these were of course the teachers who were interviewed, were those who confessed that they had contact with a bilingual learner, that they had such learners in their classes. So these were even like post-experience accounts. And when we asked them about a definition of bilingualism, well, you can see from the quotes here, we were surprised to see that the teachers had a very idealistic image of a bilingual person, of a person who has equal competence in two languages, right? As you can see it here, a person who is somehow fluent in two languages. It is the use of two languages on a very similar and well-controlled level, at least on the communicative level, if not higher. Right? As far as children are concerned, it's a kind of free switching from Polish to English. Right? But if you speak to them in Polish, they don't introduce the second language. So as you can see, no allowance for code switching, for intrasentential code switching. This is a person who feels great in two languages. It seems to me that he or she has to be fluent in both languages and understand both of them. So as you can see, this is a very, very idealistic, and actually not in line with what, definition, and actually not in line with what the research already has told us, that bilinguals actually usually that balanced bilingualism is very rare, and that one language is usually more dominant than others. As regards the attitude towards the bilingual students, generally we noticed two kinds of attitudes. There were some teachers who were simply empathetic, just like with any other newcomer child into their class. So they tried to do their best to make the child feel happy in the classroom, like placing the child in a pair with a Polish child, or they also tried to involve the child in the conversations, sometimes during extracurricular time, like during the breaks, 3 hours. They just wanted to make the child feel comfortable. Sometimes they even referred to their own experience. Like one of the teachers here mentions, oh, gee, misses his Irish school very much. When he showed me his souvenir album from school, I could see a great sadness in his eyes. So we can see there are sometimes, there are teachers who showed a great degree of empathy. But there were also some other type of attitudes, mediated, we would say, by language and behavior of the child. By language, that is, it really mattered whether the child in the English class was just another foreign language learner. That is, for him, English was also a foreign language, like, for example, for Ukrainian learners. So here we notice that in that case, there was an expectation to conform to the rules. So as long as those learners conformed to the rules and did what other children in the class did, there were no problems, right? The teachers did not notice any problem. But there were also English-speaking students. And these in reference to these students, the EFL teachers experienced a huge range of emotions, from anxiety to joy to high expectations of achievement. Because it must be mentioned, still remember that a lot of migrant children were English-speaking children, and who in fact were native speakers of English. Hence the anxiety of EFL teachers, because they were worried that the teachers well, that the students were better than the teachers. Just to quote, to illustrate these statements with a few quotations. As regards attitudes towards immigrant children, right, to those who didn't speak English, well, the teachers generally appreciated those students who were eager to learn. For example, the first teacher says, they simply see a future only in learning. These children of immigrants have it instilled in them that they have to study because it is the only way for them to get a job and possibly stay in this place or further, where it is even better. So they are very ambitious in English, but they need help in Polish. They need translation, some kind of support. Or another expression of another teacher. He didn't make any negative impression. He sat in the front, and if he didn't understand something, maybe he would ask some questions, this and that. But it was rather not that he didn't want to or couldn't. I rather perceived him as an eager one. So I think these statements illustrate, right, that the attitude towards immigrant children, that expectation of conforming to the rules. Whereas with English-speaking children, as I mentioned, well, there could be a variety of emotions. And here I just have one, which shows that the teacher was really happy to have such a child in class. I think that I will always remember this particular student, because this is the moment when a teacher, not only like 90% of the time, tries to make at least one child understand something from the lesson, but at least here there is a factor that you can let yourself, you can show to other students that learning is not just a nuisance, but you can use your everyday skills in a nice way, which can influence your learning, your life. It seems to me that I, for example, really enjoy going to class by this student. I really enjoy going to class there. But what we can also see from this excerpt is that it's not so much a teacher who helps the student to integrate into class, but the teacher really finds the student as a helpful one, right? As a kind of resource, thanks to which the teacher is happy that he finally has someone to talk to. So it is also a communicative partner, an aid. Generally, a problem is, particular problem with English-speaking problem, there is a problem with heterogeneity. Just because they are very often native speakers, they have they are practically communicative, and they are at a higher level than English-speaking children, than Polish-speaking children, than monolingual children, and it's very difficult for the teachers to conduct a class, right? And this is also a note of one teacher who says he behaves normally and is very distracted, but maybe it's because he doesn't understand a lot of things. In Polish, for example. So he fiddles with things, turns around. And in English, he works somewhat, but these are also things that have no value for him at the moment. But you would have to move him to really high conversations so that he could talk. So I think what comes from this excerpt is the fact that, of course, the child is bored, right? Because the teacher has to realize the language material, which is much below his level, and the child is simply left jobless. But we also see that the teacher probably switches to Polish, and this is also when the child does not understand what's going on. In any case, the bilingual learner is just left alone. The only solution which is proposed, and we were surprised, but this is something that, well, seemed to well, was the only thing that was offered to those English-speaking bilinguals were contests, participation in contests, which was supposed to give the children some kind of challenge and motivation for learning, but it was also a huge nuisance. As it was, because just the fact that one speaks a foreign language does not mean that he or she is prepared to take exams, that is trained in particular strategies. And contests are such kind of exams. As one of the teacher mentions, at our school, the policy is that kids who have an individual teaching program in a subject, because it doesn't have to be just English, of course, are supposed to be entered into competitions ex officio on the spur of the moment. So these competitions are the most frustrating for me. The fact that these children can't all develop at such a level, that these competitions don't always give them room to show off, because with time it becomes such a competition. I remember at the end of our work together, it was nerves, it was crying. Because there is a huge expectation that these children win the competition, but of course, they do not always cope with the demands. It's a different test of skills, right? This is a skill of taking tests, of paying attention to some small details which they have not been trained for. Some children eventually succeed, but not all. Now, what kind of practices we have identified that these teachers use? Well, the most common is, of course, an attempt to raise intercultural and plurilingual awareness. And this is the right direction, because I think practically in all English studies now, teachers have the subject of intercultural communication. And this is in fact the situation, the real classroom situation where this knowledge has to be put into practice. Some teachers were more skillful than others in doing it. And some had few creative ideas. Generally, most of the techniques resorted to preparing a presentation on the country of origin, or sometimes setting English-speaking children as role models, saying, oh, look, I can speak like him. But sometimes opportunities for translanguaging appeared, that is, allowing children to produce their own languages in the English class, which was so right, because this also allowed to arouse interest in different languages, right? Not just English. And exemplary activities contained, for example, expressing Christmas wishes in their own languages, using dictionary apps in which the children could check the vocabulary into their first language, into their dominant language, not into Polish. Reading, listening to bilingual books where there were English and another version of the text was given. Showing some similarities between words in different languages. In case of Italian or Romanian children, it worked very well. Sometimes simply sensitizing children to the melody of other languages, as will be illustrated later. One teacher gave a wonderful example of how she used a bilingual book based on the famous Masha series, TV series, which is of Russian origin, but she used it in the English classroom. And she mentioned it. Our children teach him too, meaning teach him the language. It's really something beautiful. When we learn some words, I always ask him, and how is it in Ukrainian? He even wonders sometimes. But it's cool because he also appreciates that we teach him other languages, that we are also curious about how he learns. And I'll be honest, I've also done things like that with kids like that, and it was really unusual. They were happy when I was looking for fairy tales. For example, Masha was wonderful. These Russian children are happy because they know that this is their fairy tale, that we listen to it in English, although sometimes I also play it for a while in Russian, if only to show them what a huge difference there is. But they are really wonderful. It can be combined so beautifully. It doesn't bother me. Absolutely not at all. So as we can see, just the creativity and willingness of the teacher to take the multilingual learner into account when planning her lessons, her English lessons. Other practices, of course, somehow related to heterogeneity, maybe supporting English-speaking children in maintaining their knowledge of their L1 of English, because they realize how what a resource it is, right? And helping them to to maintain the knowledge. Usually, this was done by either specially prepared worksheets or keeping a notebook for additional tasks, sometimes some individualized homework. Most often this was additional reading of books. And in one school, but we have to admit it was a private school, there was an interest circle, like an English club, and the school library where these children could borrow some books in English. Of course, it's not a very practical solution, but perhaps, some books could be, English books could be also bought by a school library, both for Polish and for English-speaking learners. In general, what the teachers confirmed, there were different kinds of problems, right? So answering a question if multilingualism is a problem, well, sometimes it is. From the perspective of the child, the problems concerned baggage of experience of migration, because very often it was forced migration. The children didn't want to come to Poland, but they had to with their parents. So this is, of course, what sometimes makes it difficult to integrate and to adjust. Sometimes a problem is lack of understanding of the child's psychosocial difficulties. You know, it must be important to realize it's a huge culture shock to come to a different school with different requirements. Usually there's, for example, a different approach to teachers. This is what already Professor Grzymała-Moszczyńska was writing about in her book about children coming back home. Culture shock, alienation. Sometimes it's difficult to find friends because the children may simply behave differently, or simply they don't know enough language to socialize with those children. Low self-esteem, therefore, and strong need to, or sometimes a strong need to be noticed. So sometimes these children dominate the class. It's very important that the teacher is also aware of these issues. Sometimes there is even lack of possibility for parents to support language development. If these are parents, well, for example, who do not speak Polish or English, and they cannot help in lessons with homework, or they cannot even sufficiently communicate with teachers. This is also what may occur in case of, for example, Ukrainian or Russian children. From the perspective of the teacher, the problems are that, well, the same, communication problems with the child or a parent sometimes, transfer of cultural behaviors and educational experiences, and of which sometimes the teachers are intolerant, whereas perhaps some kind of understanding would be advisable, because these children sometimes behave not for example, in a very direct or open manner, just because they transfer a different cultural behavior. Right, problems of adapting to the child in educational requirements, like, for example, preparation for exams, necessity to strictly comply with the rules, like using correct orthography, spelling, and using sophisticated vocabulary in essays, because this is what an essay is graded for. Also, lack of learning strategies. It must be remembered that's why these children do not succeed sometimes in contests or school leaving exams, because they picked up the language, right? They just acquired it and they are not used to studying the rules, knowing the names of tenses. This is something that has to be also taken into account. And sometimes, in case of other children, migrant children from other cultures than maybe European cultures, there might be lack of understanding of language difficulties like different alphabet, perhaps. So even copying from the board teaches illegible handwriting can be a nightmare. The child may not know what to copy. So what kind of challenges we need? First of all, of course, it's language level heterogeneity. There might be learners of different language learners in one EFL class. Subordination to external exams and contests. This is what is a nuisance to all learners and even more so to multilingual learners. Emphasis on accuracy and not so much on communication. This is where, for example, this is the place where all learners, multilingual and monolingual learners, could come into contact, whereas there is very little time devoted in class on communication just because the school leaving exam in the 8th grade does not have a communication part. So it seems communication is actually not practiced, not developed. And finally, lack of individualization. Generally, very few teachers mentioned some kind of individual attention to multilingual learners, for example, by giving them additional or individualized homework or individualized tasks during the lesson. But there are also opportunities which we noticed, and this is what some of the teachers quite skillfully used, like development of intercultural competence, of course, improving communicative competence on the basis of authentic information gap. And there should be many more activities like that, particularly with English-speaking children who may be used as English-speaking partners in class, right? In pairs or in activities of the type hot seat, when an English-speaking child could be placed in the center and could be asked questions, for example. Here it's also very important to note that having such a learner in class, it's very important that English is the language of instruction and communication, because if teachers switch into Polish too often or switch at all, this makes it difficult actually to multilinguals to understand. So an English class does not become any easier for them. It's even more difficult because 2 other languages are used. And it would be very useful if the teacher used his own linguistic resources to communicate or to make the multilingual child feel comfortable in class. As we saw in the case of one of the teacher, he used she used her knowledge of Russian plus some non-verbal communication just to communicate with the monolingual child. So it seems that in case of having such children in class, there is a scope for multilingual pedagogy, which is quite often advocated nowadays, particularly in Western European countries. But I think it might be gradually also introduced in Polish schools. Some aspects of it, for example, referring to similarities and differences between languages, like, of course, words. First of all, words that the word tranquil means the same as tranquillo in Italian, right? Or syntax in English, like perfect tenses, are similar to perfect tenses in German. So if the teacher, if the English teacher knows any languages, even to a small degree, he or she may use this knowledge to also to refer to the child's languages. Also, it would be useful to promote transfer of learning of the second language to third languages and others. And also allowing the use of native languages, of course, to a limited degree. I'm not saying, well, because it's an English class, but perhaps in some translation exercises, because translation into Polish, at least in the beginning stages, will be very difficult. Or use of e-dictionaries to their home languages, maybe using bilingual booklets, as we mentioned. So in conclusion, well, what we may say, we observed that there were some teachers really who were supportive of student-school integration, and they were usually characterized with empathy, perhaps also experience of growing up bilingual. Not all, but empathy seemed to be the key feature. We also observed that successful socialization of multilinguals depends on teachers' own agency. So the teacher has to be willing and active to help such a child in his class, has to plan class activities appropriately. But if he does so, if he treats a multilingual as a resource and not a problem, such socialization can be successful. So I think in case of some teachers, such socialization has turned out to be successful. As this last quotation says, Teacher 4 mentioned, recently I even had a situation where a little boy, this one from Romania, didn't turn off his microphone and talk to his mother in Romanian, his native language. And as the children talked, they stopped talking and listened. And I didn't specifically mute him because I